He was 10 seconds into the second verse when he stopped. Not because the microphone cut out. Not because someone rushed the stage. Not because anything went wrong in the way things would go wrong later that night at the Mecca Arena in Milwaukee. The chaos that journalists would write about the next morning, the coins thrown from the crowd, the controlled rage that eventually overran the barricades of his composure, none of that had happened yet. The show was 10 minutes old. Everything was still in front of him. He stopped because he saw something. The band kept playing for 2 more beats before they understood to stop. 3,000 people who had been at full roar dropped into a confused silence, watching Tupac Shakur stand at the front of the stage and look at something in the crowd with an expression that wasn't performing anything. Not anger, not calculation. The expression of a man who has seen something that requires his full attention and has simply stopped everything else to give it. He stayed like that for 5 seconds. 10. Long enough that the people near the front of the crowd turned to look at what he was looking at. What they found was a man in a wheelchair, sitting alone at the edge of the accessible section, slightly separated from the 3,000 people pressing toward the barricade. Eyes closed, body turned toward the stage, in a space that was technically inside the concert but that also existed, the way those spaces always exist, slightly outside the full experience of it. Tupac walked to the edge of the stage. What happened in the next 20 minutes was not filmed, not documented, not included in any of the accounts that survived that September night in Milwaukee. The photographers had their lenses pointed at the wrong place. The journalists were watching the wrong thing. It lived only in the memory of the people close enough to see it. And 30 years later, those people still talk about it the same way, slowly, carefully, like something fragile they don't want to break by describing it wrong. To understand what Tupac Shakur was carrying on to the Mecca Arena stage that September night, you have to understand what 1994 had already done to him. He was 23 years old. He had released 2 studio albums, both of which had established him as something the music industry didn't quite have a category for. Not gangsta rap exactly. Not conscious rap exactly. Something that moved between those registers with a speed and emotional range that made critics reach for contradictions when they tried to describe him. He had acted in Juice, in Poetic Justice, in Above the Rim, the film whose soundtrack had just been released that summer, and which contained Pour Out a Little Liquor, a thug life track that would become one of his most enduring recordings. He had been on the cover of magazines. He had sold records and toured and built a following that was unlike anything his peers had achieved. He had also been in and out of legal trouble for most of those 2 years, in ways that followed him from city to city, and that his lawyers and managers were still working to contain. He had served 15 days in jail for an assault conviction. He had other cases pending. He was 23 years old, and already living the particular exhaustion of a man who spends his days in courtrooms and his nights on stages, who can feel the walls of his life narrowing even as his fame expands. Thug Life, Volume 1, was 3 weeks away from its release date. The group, Tupac, Big Psych, Makata Mo Preme, the Rated R, had been performing the material from the album in the months before release, taking it to cities where Tupac's presence alone was enough to fill arenas. Milwaukee was one of those cities. The Mecca Arena that night held a bill that included Boss, Big Mike, Xscape, Spice One, Scarface, a deep lineup in the era when hip-hop concerts were still putting together package shows with 5 or 6 acts, each one getting 20 minutes before the headliner closed. Tupac was the headliner. He was always the headliner. But backstage that evening, the people who worked with him regularly had noticed something. He was quieter than usual, not in a way that suggested anything was wrong, more in the way of a man who has been carrying something for a while and has gotten so accustomed to the weight that he no longer shifts it around. The legal battles, the media attention that had turned from celebratory to predatory so quickly he'd barely had time to register the change, the particular loneliness of being the most visible person in any room and still feeling unseen in the ways that actually mattered. He had told an interviewer earlier that year that he felt like the world wanted him to be one thing, hard, aggressive, without vulnerability, and that performing was the only place where he was allowed to be more than that, where the crowd's need for something real gave him permission to give something real, where the transaction between performer and audience was honest in a way that other transactions in his life were not. He walked onto the Mecca Arena stage that night, looking for that transaction. He found something else first. The man in the wheelchair was named Marcus. He was 28 years old. He had been in the wheelchair for 4 years, since a car accident on I-94 outside of Milwaukee that had left him with a spinal cord injury that the doctors said was permanent. He had spent those 4 years rebuilding his life in the way that people rebuild lives after the thing they cannot undo, slowly, with setbacks, with the particular grief that comes not from the original event but from every small moment afterward that reminds you of the distance between who you were and who you are now. He had been a dancer. Before the accident, before the wheelchair, before the 4 years of physical therapy and the renegotiation of every space in the world, Marcus had been the kind of man who showed up at a hip-hop show and found his way to the front of the crowd and stayed there, moving with the music in the full physical experience of it. He had gone to concerts not to watch but to participate, in the wordless communion of bodies moving in the same rhythm at the same time. That is what live music offers that no recording can replicate. He could no longer do that. What he could do was get to the accessible section at the Mecca Arena and watch, which was something, not nothing. His brother had pushed him in from the parking lot and found the space designated for wheelchair users and positioned him there, at the edge of the section, with a sightline to the stage. And Marcus had watched the opening acts and waited for Tupac, who was the reason he had come, whose music had been in his apartment on rotation for the past 2 years, whose songs about pain and survival and the refusal to be defined by what the world had done to you had found Marcus in the middle of his own renegotiation and said something he needed to hear. When Tupac walked onto the stage, Marcus did what he always did when the music started. He closed his eyes. He let the bass from the speakers move through the metal frame of the wheelchair and into his body. He found in that physical vibration something that approximated what he used to feel when he was on his feet and in the crowd. He didn't know that Tupac had seen him. What Tupac saw was a man with his eyes closed, a man who had positioned himself as close to the music as he could get from where he was, a man whose entire body was oriented toward the stage in a way that communicated something that Tupac, who had been reading audiences since he was a teenager performing in small venues in the Bay Area, understood immediately. He stopped mid-verse. He walked to the edge of the stage. The crowd, which had been roaring, began to quiet in the way crowds quiet when they understand that something is happening that is not part of the planned performance. Not silence, exactly. 3,000 people don't go silent in an instant, but a shift. A change in the room's energy from anticipation to attention. "Hold up," Tupac said into the microphone. Not to the crowd, not to the band, just a statement of fact to the room. "Hold up." He looked at Marcus. Marcus had opened his eyes when the music stopped. He was looking at the stage, not yet understanding that he was being looked at. "Yo," Tupac said, directly to him. "You, I see you, man." The crowd turned. 3,000 people following the performer's gaze to the accessible section, finding Marcus there in his wheelchair, looking back at the stage with an expression that had not yet caught up with what was happening. "What's your name?" Tupac said. Marcus answered. His brother, standing beside the wheelchair, later said that Marcus's voice barely carried over the crowd noise, but that Tupac waited until he heard it. "Marcus," Tupac repeated into the microphone, so the whole arena could hear it. Just the name, said like it mattered. What happened in the next 20 minutes is the part of this story that does not compress easily into summary. Tupac did not stop the show in the way that gets written about in music journalism. The dramatic gesture, the clear narrative, the moment that announces itself as significant. He stopped it the way a person stops when they have noticed something that requires their full attention, quietly, without ceremony, with the particular focus of a man who has spent his whole life being hyper-aware of the people around him, and who has, in this moment, located the one person in the building whose experience of the music matters most to him. He crouched at the edge of the stage. He called Marcus closer, or rather called to Marcus's brother, who wheeled the chair to the barricade directly below where Tupac was crouched. And then Tupac and Marcus talked, not for the crowd, not into the microphone, not at full volume. The crowd could see them but could not fully hear them, and the crowd understood the way crowds understand these things, that they were witnessing something that was not for them, that they were being trusted with a private moment, and that the correct response was to be still and let it happen. Tupac asked how long. Marcus told him. 4 years. Tupac asked what he had been doing before. Marcus told him, dancing. There was a pause that people close to the barricade described as long enough to feel significant. Tupac, looking at this man who had been a dancer for 28 years and for the last 4 had been navigating a world that had not been built for him, that put barriers between him and the full experience of the things he loved, that placed him at the edge of the accessible section, slightly separated from the crowd pressing against the barricade. "You came out here tonight," Tupac said. "Not a question. A statement of recognition. You came out here." Marcus said he came to hear the music. Tupac nodded. He stood up. He looked at his band. "I got something I need to do," he said to no one in particular. Then to the arena. "Give me a minute." What Tupac did next had never been done before at a Thug Life concert. He walked to the back of the stage. He spoke to his DJ. He came back to the microphone with something different in his posture. Not the performance posture, the one that carried the weight of the show and the crowd's expectations and the pressure of the headliner slot. Something more personal than that. He said, "There's a brother out here tonight named Marcus. He used to dance. He can't dance no more. And he came here tonight anyway, because the music matters. And I think that's the bravest thing I've seen in a while." 3,000 people in the Mecca Arena were completely still. "I'm going to ask y'all to do something," Tupac said. "I'm going to ask every person in this building who can stand up right now to stand up, and I'm going to ask y'all to dance. Not for yourselves, for Marcus. So he can see what the music does to people, so he can feel it." The arena took a moment to process this. Then someone stood up. Then someone else. Then sections of the crowd rising together, until the Mecca Arena was a room full of people standing, looking at each other with the particular expression of people who are being asked to do something that feels too small for what is being asked and too big for what they expected when they walked through the doors. Tupac nodded at his DJ. The music started. Not "Bury Me a G," not the hard material from the Thug Life set, but something slower, something that gave people room to move in a way that was about the music and not about performing for anyone. And 3,000 people in Milwaukee danced, not for themselves. For Marcus, who was below the stage looking up, watching the crowd move, with an expression that his brother described 30 years later as the closest he had seen to his brother's face before the accident, before the wheelchair, before the 4 years of rebuilding. The music moved through the arena, through the speakers and the floor and the metal frame of the wheelchair, through 3,000 bodies moving in the same rhythm at the same time, through Marcus, who had his eyes open now, who was watching the crowd with an attention that had nothing in it of the spectator and everything in it of the participant. He was not on the outside of the music. He was at the center of it. Tupac finished the song. He looked down at Marcus one more time. "You feel that?" he said. Marcus nodded. "That's yours," Tupac said. "That's always going to be yours. Don't let nobody take that from you." He stood up. He addressed the crowd. "Milwaukee, you did something tonight," he said. His voice had a different quality to it than it had at the start of the show. Not softer exactly, more honest. The voice of a man who has been surprised by something and is not trying to hide it. "I see y'all. I appreciate y'all." Then the show resumed. The chaos that journalists would write about came later. The mic problems, the mounting anger, the night eventually coming apart at the seams in ways that had nothing to do with what had happened in those first 20 minutes. The accounts that survived described the Milwaukee concert as a troubled night, a difficult show, an example of the pressure Tupac was under in the fall of 1994 expressing itself in ways that spilled beyond his control. Those accounts are not wrong. The chaos was real, but they are incomplete because they begin at the wrong moment. 90 days after the Milwaukee concert, Tupac Shakur was shot 5 times in the lobby of Quad Recording Studios in New York City. He survived. He checked himself out of the hospital the next morning against his doctor's orders, arrived at a Manhattan courthouse in a wheelchair to hear a jury's verdict, and continued moving through the world in the particular way of a man who has survived something that should have killed him and does not yet know what to do with the survival. But the version of Tupac Shakur who stood at the edge of the Mecca Arena stage and looked at Marcus and told him that the music was his, that version did not survive Quad Studios intact. Something changed in November 1994 in the lobby of that building that changed everything afterward. The openness, the willingness to stop mid-verse for a stranger, the capacity to see one person in a crowd of 3,000 and understand that this person's experience of the music was the most important thing happening in the room. Those things did not disappear. They went underground. They became harder to access, buried under layers of armor that the next 2 years would require him to build and maintain. The Tupac, who emerged from prison in October 1995 and signed with Death Row and released All Eyes on Me, and performed at the House of Blues for what would be the last time that Tupac was still capable of tenderness, still capable of being reached by individual human need. But it cost him more. It took more to get there. The path between the performance and the man had grown longer and more difficult to navigate. He died on September 13, 1996. He was 25 years old. He never returned to Milwaukee. Marcus is in his late 50s now. He still lives in the Milwaukee area. He has told this story many times over the years, to people who knew him, and to people he met later who became people who knew him. He has told it as a music story, as a Tupac story, as a story about what it felt like to be seen by someone who didn't have to see him. He has also told it as a story about dancing, not about the accident, and not about the wheelchair, and not about the 4 years of physical therapy or the renegotiation of every space in the world, about dancing, about what it felt like to be at the center of the music instead of at its edge, about what Tupac gave him that night by doing something so simple it barely seems worth cataloging, stopping, looking, seeing, naming, asking 3,000 people to give a stranger the experience of the music. His brother, who was there that night, who pushed the wheelchair to the barricade and watched what happened, said something in an interview about that September evening that stayed with the person who heard it for a long time afterward. He said, "The thing about Pac is he looked for people, not the crowd, individual people. He would find the one person in the room who needed something and give them that thing before he gave the room anything." He paused. "I don't know how he did that," he said. "I don't know how anybody does that." The Mecca Arena in Milwaukee no longer exists under that name. It has been renovated and renamed multiple times since 1994, cycling through identities the way arenas do, the names on the outside changing while the structure underneath stays the same. The floor where 3,000 people stood and danced for Marcus is still there. The rigging above the stage where the lights were hung that September night is still there. Nobody marked the spot at the edge of that stage where Tupac crouched and looked at a man in a wheelchair and saw him. But Marcus was there. And the 3,000 people who stood up when Tupac asked them to stand up were there. And the music moved through all of them. Through the speakers, through the floor, through the metal frame of a wheelchair, through bodies moving in the same rhythm at the same time, and gave one man what he had come for. Not because it was filmed, not because it was documented or archived or included in any account of what made that night significant. Because Tupac Shakur looked out at the crowd and found the one person who needed the most, and stopped everything to make sure that person felt the music the way the music was supposed to be felt. That is what he was. In the best moments, before 1994 took what it took, and the years after took the rest. That is the version of him that nobody filmed,